Thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks for the kind invitation. It's really nice to be here. It's a beautiful institute, so I'm really impressed by the facilities and the people. So good to be here. Yeah, so I'll give a bit of a worldwide overview of some of the research we're engaged in. On the one hand, in the neuroscience domain, on the other hand, more on the AI domain. I think I have way too many slides for 1 hour, so let's just see where we end up. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just feel free to interrupt. All right. So I'm heading the Artificial Cognitive Systems Lab, and it's really a lab at the intersection between, on the one hand, AI, artificial intelligence, and on the other hand, natural intelligence or neuroscience. One thing we are really focusing on is the development of AI methods that advance our understanding of brain function. And secondly, and that's also research we're getting more and more engaged in, is we aim to create more brain-inspired AI systems. So the talk is composed of those two aspects, so more AI for neuroscience, and the second part more on neuro for AI, but I'm afraid we will never get at the second part, so let's see. Okay. So if we think about how AI can actually help us understand brain function, there are a couple of questions that come up. So how to model neural systems, how to identify these systems from data, and how can we optimally control these systems? So these are questions we are working on. And a little bit of past work. So this is work of about, I think, 10 years ago by now. So what we have shown is that deep neural networks, so the kind of artificial neural networks that are being developed in AI, actually show a very nice correspondence to what's going on in our own brains. And I'll give an example of this. So what we did is we basically have this stimulus, we show it to a deep neural network. So this deep neural network consists of multiple layers, and each of these layers basically learns more and more complex representations. So what we can do is, of course, show the same stimulus to a person in an MRI scanner, and we can measure observed brain activity. And then the question is there actually a correspondence between the deep neural network representations and the brain representations we measured? And one way to address that question is to just learn a linear mapping from certain layers in this deep neural network to different brain regions. And if we do this, we see this very nice correspondence between early layers in the deep neural network that are sensitive to simple stimulus features that map very nicely to early visual cortex, and deeper layers in the neural network that are sensitive to more semantic content and faces and all these things. And it's mapping to more downstream areas in the anterior temporal lobe. So there's a very nice mapping between the artificial models we created and how our own brains basically respond to sensory inputs. It's also not completely coincidental, because these deep neural networks actually come out of neuroscience to model simple complex cell representations. And we nicely see that there is this correspondence. So one thing to say about this is that this is a rather indirect approach. So we train this neural network on stimuli, and post hoc we see is this actually related to what the brain is doing. So a nicer, more direct approach is to say, well, let's just condition these deep neural networks on observed brain activity. So can we train a network to immediately predict observed brain responses instead of just solving some kind of image categorization task? So this is what we did here. We actually collected our own data set, the so-called Doctor Who data set. So we placed a master student in the scanner for 25 hours, and we showed all the Doctor Who videos in multiple sessions. This person really became an expert on Doctor Who, and he was very happy actually with the experience. But we used this to actually ask, can we, when we measure brain activity under that Doctor Who response, can we actually predict brain responses? So what we did is we trained this network. Oh, just a sec. So we trained this deep network directly to predict different brain region responses. And then for the early layers, we condition on V1. And for later layers, we condition on downstream areas. And the nice thing is that if you train these models, they predict brain responses, but you can also start to do virtual experiments on these models. So if you do standard population receptive field mapping on these deep neural networks, you really get all the classical responses we see in real brains. So we can use it kind of as a substitute for the real thing. So we train on naturalistic inputs, and later we can actually use all kinds of more artificial experimental designs on that surrogate model without needing to do the experiment ourselves in humans. All right. So, oh, I have to go back. So this is all very nice, but of course the brain is not a deep neural network, right? So it's basically a nonlinear transformation consisting of multiple layers. Well, the brain is a massively recurrent system, consists of feedback loops, is a biophysical system, etc. So there's actually quite a big gap between these kinds of models and what real brains are all about. So over the last period, we've tried to develop a more principled approach to actually building brain models. And that's what I'll explain in the next few slides. So if we want to create this principled approach, we first need to think about, okay, what is the brain doing? And well, I'm an AI researcher, so coming from AI, I basically see a brain as an intelligent agent that transforms external inputs into control outputs in order to act in the world, right? So we have this perception action cycle. And what I want to be able to do is based on measured outputs, so that's behavioral outputs, motor responses, but also based on brain measurements I get from my recording devices and the sensory input I provide to this brain. I want to actually learn the underlying system that realizes this transformation. And I want to do this in a more biophysically inspired way. So if we want to build a computational model, then it should really act as a digital twin that captures mechanisms of information processing, of neural information processing. So the way we can approach that from a machine learning perspective is to adopt stochastic state space models. So a state space model is basically a computational model, and it transforms inputs, so controls U, into outputs Y, and the stuff in between, the axis you see here, is basically our brain, right? So we need to learn representations of brain dynamics that explain this input-output transformation. That's the goal we are after. A few things that are important here is that if we look at our brain, it's really a system that exists in nature. So dynamics unfold in continuous time. So it's a continuous time system. It's also perturbed by noise. So we can have process noise in the system. So we need to create stochastic systems. The systems are partially observed because if we collect brain measurements, of course, we are not collecting the state of the whole system. We are really having just a small lens or window into the underlying system. And we want to capture the dynamics. And we can do this in a very principled way. So the dynamics model, so the brain model we are going to develop is actually a stochastic differential equation or a system of stochastic differential equations. So if we look at the natural sciences, then basically all of these systems are modeled in terms of equations of motion of a system using coupled differential equations. So think about Newtonian physics, or think about modeling the weather, or Brownian motion of particles. All these things can be captured using differential equations. And we can adopt the exact same approach for neuroscience. Okay, so let's formalize this a little bit. So what do these models look like? And I have to explain the equations that are behind it. So let's assume that xt is the neural state, so the state of our brain at a certain moment in time. And let ut denote the external input. And the external input can be the sensory input we experience. So what we now do is we model this underlying latent, so not directly observed neural dynamics using a system of, that's long words, parameterized, controlled stochastic differential equations. So the equation here shows the functional form. So what this equation basically says is, well, dx, so the change in the brain state, that's what dx denotes, is actually a function of time. So that's the mu here. So mu is basically the deterministic part of our dynamics. And this deterministic part depends on our current brain state because, well, the brain is a dynamical system. So that's why this x appears in mu. But it's also affected by the control input u, our sensory input. And we might have this stochastic term. This is the second part. So sigma denotes how noise fluctuations enter the system. So if we want to model noisy brain dynamics, we also need this additional part. So this is a stochastic differential equation, and it consists of parameters theta, and these parameters we want to fit, because these parameters are going to change the dynamics, and we want to make them as close as possible to how our own brains respond. So this is an abstract representation, so just a stochastic differential equation, but we need to formalize it in terms of a concrete representation. So what we assume is that we can model brain dynamics using so-called coupled oscillators. In this case, coupled stochastic Stewart-Landau oscillators. So these are models that exist in the complex plane, so that's shown on the right, and they show oscillatory behavior. But we can also represent them in terms of their real and imaginary components. So what we basically say is that our brain state can be modeled using such a coupled oscillator model. And it consists of a number of parameters, namely the frequency of these oscillations, certain bifurcation parameters, coupling strength, which tells us about how are certain brain regions coupled together when we have those dynamics. And we need to estimate all of these parameters. So we also have driving input, so that's our sensory input, but we also have a trick to map the very rich sensory input, which can be basically all of our visual and auditory input, into a low dimensional representation. So we do that via a so-called input encoder and an interpolation function, which basically tells us, well, the input to our dynamical system is a compressed low dimensional representation of what's actually going on in the outside world. And going back to the deep neural networks, so we can actually use a deep neural network to perform a mapping from all of space around us towards a low dimensional compressed representation. So what these systems do is they, on the one hand, combine biophysical modeling with the use of deep neural networks as developed in the AI community. So if we have those brain dynamics, we also need to initialize the first state, right? So I cannot just run the dynamics. I need to know, where do I start from? So in order to estimate where the brain starts in terms of its dynamics, we also need a model that tells us how this initial state is generated. And basically what I say here is that the initial state, x0, is sampled from a Gaussian, but this Gaussian has parameterized means and variances. And these means and variances depend on an encoding of all the observations I did so far. So what I say is, well, I have prior knowledge. So suppose I get a subject in the MRI scanner. Maybe I measure some data, resting state data. I can actually use that to predict the initial state of where the brain dynamics kind of start. So this is all very different from the more artificial neural network models, but I would argue that these are the things we really want to do and should do if we are interested in modeling neural systems in a very accurate way, while taking into account all of the uncertainty in our systems. So this was about modeling brain dynamics, but we are only indirectly observing those brain dynamics, either via maybe invasive recordings or via fMRI, or maybe using behavioral measurements, etc. So what we need to do is we also need to build observation models. And these observation models typically come in the form of statistical models. For instance, what I say here is that if I have generated spikes, I can actually use a Poisson model to simulate spike generation. And the parameter of this Poisson model, lambda, is actually dependent indirectly. It's conditioned on the brain state X. So what I'm saying is that there's this nonlinear transformation. It's again a deep neural network that translates the underlying brain state into the parameter of a Poisson model that generates my spikes. So that's the way to formalize this. And I can do this as well for behavioral observations. So what I can also say is, well, my behavioral output is just a Gaussian partial mapping from the brain state to the observed data. And because these are probability distributions, I'm also taking observation noise or observation uncertainty into account. So I really strongly want to emphasize that we need to do that if we want to get at accurate models of the underlying dynamics. Okay, so we can do it for continuous outputs like arm position or pupil diameter, but we can also do it for categorical outputs like two alternative force choice tasks. All right, so that's a lot of the machinery behind it. So we can also make it work. Yeah, so So this is about the modeling part. We also need to estimate the parameters of these models from data. And that's where we enter in the field of machine learning, or in this case, scientific machine learning. So we have all these parameters, and there could be hundreds or thousands of them, because these are the parameters of our neural network models that constitute the nonlinear transformations I was just talking about. And we want to estimate these parameters from observational data. So I have my experiment, I collect data, which could be stimulus input and observed brain response, and I want to estimate what's going on in the middle. So this is a classical system identification task. I want to estimate the underlying system that generates my observed responses. So this is basically a machine learning approach to scientific discovery. We want to discover what's going on. And this is also based on parameterized differential equations. And this approach is already widely adopted across many domains. So think about cosmology, for instance, or certain parts of life sciences. And I would argue that also in neuroscience, we should really adopt this approach if we want to be at the forefront of methods development for these types of problems. Okay, so the way to estimate these model parameters is using variational inference. So because we are dealing with probabilistic, stochastic systems, we need to have very specialized solvers to do this. I could write down dozens of equations on what that solver looks like. I'm not going to do that, so I'm just going to say, if you're interested in the inference part, just look at the paper I'm citing downstairs. But we have ways to actually estimate the parameters of such models. And the nice thing is also that if we are developing these models that are generative models of our observations, we are also automatically solving data fusion problems, because we can just say we have multiple readouts. Could be observational data, could be fMRI data, could be whatever. Doesn't matter. We just are after the underlying dynamics that explain all of these data. Okay. So for an application in the context of neuroscience, so we use these coupled oscillator models, and we estimated their dynamics using 3 neural data sets. These are data sets that are already existing, but it's basically invasive data measured in monkeys for perturbed reach task, visual decision making, and delayed reach tasks. And we basically get the system to work. Well, one thing to mention is that we compare our coupled oscillator stochastic differential equation with different kinds of models that are being used in the field. So if you look at the RNNs on the top, these are the more conventional models that are currently being used in the domain of, let's say, computational cognitive neuroscience. So what we see is that we do much better in terms of predicted responses, also predicted behavioral responses fitting to the observational data, compared to these more standard AI models. So that's one advantage. So what we also see is that the stochastic versions, so the versions that incorporate noise in the underlying brain dynamics, actually do better than the deterministic versions. So it's a bit cumbersome. So if you move to the stochastic domain, you need all these specialized machinery. But what we also show is that you really want to incorporate this into your system in order to get proper estimates. Yeah, so we outperform these more standard neural network models. And what's also important to realize is that if you look at the parameter counts, we are using an order of magnitude fewer parameters. So these coupled oscillators are very efficient representations of generic dynamics. So we need fewer parameters to actually fit complex dynamics, which is an advantage as well. So one question is, so why are these stochastic models that incorporate randomness, why do they do better than the deterministic variants? So, well, one reason is that they could be capturing aleatoric uncertainty. So what I mean by aleatoric is process noise in the system. So aleatoric, alea means dice in Greece, I think. And it means that there are like these random perturbations in the system which we cannot get rid of. They are just part of the underlying dynamics, and we need to take them into account. So that could be one reason. The other reason could be epistemic uncertainty. So what I mean by that is that we might not have knowledge on the underlying system, and by incorporating stochasticity, we're actually learning probability distributions over latent states that could capture our uncertainty about how to actually model brain dynamics. So these are 2 reasons. Okay, so this is a bit of a more qualitative picture. It might be a little bit small, but basically what you see is on the left you see the task, and then in the middle you basically see the system as it evolves over time. So basically we are generating trajectories over time as these tasks are being created. So these are our coupled oscillators at work. And on the output side, we basically see what it generates. So we have two observation models for the first task. So one is generating spike data, and the other one is generating the cursor position of the monkey, of the arm of the monkey. And what we see in purple with the cursor position is the real cursor position, and in blue we are actually capturing the true cursor position really well by predictions of the model. The nice thing is also that we have error bars on top because we are capturing the uncertainty in the system. So these are really producing very nice results in this invasive setting. We can also start to interpret the parameters of these models. So I'm showing the frequencies of the different oscillators that predict the dynamics, as well as the coupling strength, so the coupling between oscillators. And there are a few observations to make. So for instance, for some of the tasks, we see increasing oscillatory coupling as the task proceeds. So that could relate, and we're just hypothesizing here, right? So that could relate to information integration during coordinated motor output. We also see a drop in coupling strength in the second task. That's where I think the sensory input changes. So that could relate to reallocation of processing resources. And we also see that there are differences in the frequency gradient. So for instance, we see a higher frequency in M1 compared to dorsal premotor cortex. And that could be related to the hierarchical organization of our cortex and the fact that they are operating at different frequency scales. So there's also a way to interpret these models. Okay, so just a few slides on optimal control. So I also mentioned in the beginning that we're interested in that question. I don't have the time to go completely into this, but what I can say is that in the end, if we look at neurotech, a lot of the neurotech problems relate to optimal control. So think about control of epileptic seizures or work we have been engaged in the past, controlling brain implants that restore vision in blind people. And some of the people in the audience have been working on this in my group. So these are really optimal control problems from an AI perspective. And how do we solve that? So one thing we are working on, and that's not done yet, but initial results look promising, is we can actually use the models I discussed in the first part of the talk and say, well, I have this model of what the brain is doing. So I can see it as a surrogate model of the real system. I can actually use that in model-based control contexts, like model predictive control. So what can you do? You can say, well, I want to make forecasts about the future using my brain model, and I condition this on future control inputs. And if I do that very, very often, I can actually choose that control input, which actually gives me the best brain response. So the idea is that I have brain dynamics. I want to steer it in a certain direction. So think about epilepsy, for instance. I want to minimize the probability that I will see epileptic seizures in the future. And I just can use my model to actually compute what the optimal controls are at the next moment in time in order to reduce the probability that in the future I will see these seizures. And that's what you call model predictive control. So this is a framework we are developing. So very briefly, a few developments in our group on optimal control theory. So one thing we are doing is we are developing a model of epileptic seizure generation, and it's actually a variant of the coupled oscillator models I showed in the beginning. So if you modify them a little bit, they can show bistable behavior, which means that they get reasonable small oscillations, or you get these huge fluctuations that kind of reflect epileptic seizure generation. And we're using these models to find solutions to controlling those systems. And if we can map these systems to real brains, well, then we are good to go. It's a big if, of course. But yeah. One other thing we have been focusing on is the use of Bayesian optimization. That's an advanced technique in machine learning. And we can use that technique to actually optimize stimulation of brain implants in blind people in order to induce percepts. So the backstory to this is that if you are fully blind and I stimulate your visual cortex, I can still generate light flashes in your visual field. And if I can do that in a controlled way, I can actually restore some of your perceptual experience. And basically, testing these electrodes and setting the optimal parameters is a very cumbersome task. Using these optimization methods, we can actually massively speed up this procedure. And that's also a control problem. Okay, I'll skip these things for now, but just to say we are developing also new approaches in machine learning that are pushing the boundaries on control theory that are applicable in neuroscience, but also in other contexts like robot control or what have you. All right. So I'm just looking at the time. Okay, still have some time. So one question is, if you look at these control problems, so how can I actually know if my control input makes sense? So think, for instance, again about a person who's fully blind, and I will stimulate your visual cortex, induce certain percepts. How do I know if you actually have a reasonable percept of the environment, right? And that's where these decoding methods we have also been developing come into play. And there the question is, if we measure brain activity, can we actually reconstruct what your percepts are? Can we reconstruct your perceptual content? This is a line we have been working on for over a decade as well. And I'm just going to show a little bit of the work we have done in the past and the most recent work we ended up doing. So what we wanted to do here, and I'll just skip through this, is we wanted to see if I present these kinds of stimuli on the screen, if I measure brain activity using fMRI, can I actually reconstruct that image just purely from brain activity? And we developed this very simple model. It's basically a linear regression model. So we assume that the mapping from stimulus to the brain is linear. We assume that the noise in the system is Gaussian. And why do we do that? So we always do that as AI or machine learning researchers, because then you get analytical solutions to the optimal solution. So we basically have this mapping from stimulus to brain response. And by invoking a Bayes rule, we can actually invert this process and compute our most probable stimulus just based on the observational data. So the data we have are regression coefficients of the linear model we fitted to training data, measured response Y, and some covariance estimates. And if you do that, that actually works really, really well. So these are reconstructions of internal percepts from brain data alone. And that's 10 years ago. We got this to work pretty nice. Of course, the real world is not linear and it's not Gaussian, etc. And this worked well for these very simple controlled stimuli, but it fails completely if you look at more naturalistic stimuli. So can we actually start to push the boundaries on that? So luckily for us, there were some developments in AI. In the meantime, you might have noticed in the news, right, that AI is kind of becoming a bit of a hot topic. But it also led to the creation of these new algorithms. And one of these algorithms are generative adversarial networks. And what these networks basically do is they say, well, they are generative models, so they can generate stimuli. And they work by having a generative model. It's a neural network that starts from a simple latent code, could be just a random vector, and it just starts to generate faces. And by having this generative model play a game against a discriminator network, you get better and better reconstructions. So what the generator does is it generates face-like images. And what the discriminator does is it tries to distinguish, is my input a generated face or a real face? So in the beginning, the generator is very bad, so it will create just random inputs. The discriminator starts to learn to discriminate random inputs from real faces, but then the generator starts to learn from that information how to push its own parameters in the right direction. And by doing that, you can actually start to generate very realistic images. So how do we use that in neuroscience? So what we can now do is we can learn a mapping from brain responses to this latent code. Because if I can predict a latent code that corresponds to a certain face, then I can reconstruct that face. And indeed, so this is again fMRI data. These are two subjects. These are four faces that were being presented. And by applying this approach, we can actually start to reconstruct those faces and their semantic features quite well. And this is really afforded by these developments in AI. Right. Okay, so well, this was an old model because it's 2017. This is historical from the perspective of AI. And we can start to use these more advanced generative models. And these are our most recent results. So this is work by Tirsa Dado, PhD student in the group who recently finished her PhD. It's also joint work with Umut Güçlü and Yağmur Güçlü-Türk. And what we see in humans is that we get these kinds of reconstructions. So it starts to look really, really impressive. And we can also get this to work on electrophysiological data. So this is work with the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience. So also in monkeys, we can start to reconstruct their percepts. So, well, how is this useful? So we can use this as a window into the brain, right? So we can start to, for instance, look at different brain regions and ask how much of the perceptual content can I reconstruct? Or in the context of neurotechnology, I can use this as an estimator of perceptual quality if I steer the brain in a certain direction. So that's the way we view this. It's an unsolved problem because this is all perceptual input. So I show an image on the screen, and then I reconstruct what you saw. Ideally, you want to start to reconstruct internal percepts generated during dreaming or mental imagery, etc. We didn't crack that nut yet. I think it's doable, but it's also really hard to go from perception to imagery because even the training data itself is ill-defined. Okay, very briefly, so we also generalized this to video reconstruction. So that's what you see in an example of here. It's not perfect, but definitely there's correspondences between the ground truth and the reconstruction to a certain extent. And yeah, okay, so I'll skip this, but basically to say is this is not restricted to the visual domain. So we have also used these AI models to reconstruct speech based on ECOG data. I'm not sure if this works, but so what you will hear is the real world, the real word in Dutch, and then the reconstructed word. So just to give you an inkling of how far we are. Yeah, okay. So there's some correspondence, I would say. But these things are happening. So using these kinds of models, really linking this, for instance, to ChatGPT style models to generate language, right? Because this is the auditory input. But actually, we might be interested in the semantic word reconstructions. These things are happening. Okay. Yeah, so that was the first part of the talk. And I'm looking at Patrick on how much time I have left. 10, 20 minutes, 15? Yeah, 15. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about the other part of the work we're doing in my group. So this was really linked to neuroscience. So trying to understand natural intelligence. So we're also interested in building brain-inspired intelligent systems. So really trying to build AI models that are more reminiscent of our own brains. Yeah, and we do that via the route of neuromorphic computing. So what is neuromorphic computing? So it's basically a brain-inspired unconventional computing paradigm that aims to mimic neural information processing in biological systems. Yeah. So one motivation for this is that if we can do that, we might become orders of magnitude more efficient than current AI systems. Well, given the fact that we have to restart nuclear plants to get our ChatGPT models to work, it's kind of nice if we can push on this energy efficiency side. And one important difference is that these neuromorphic systems are analog compute models, whereas our current technology is all digital compute. It's very different. Well, as I say here, these neuromorphic systems also should become robust in the presence of noisy physical devices, because if we can do that, then we can maybe map AI models directly to the physics. So can we build physical learning machines? That's what we are interested in. So it also assumes that there's no distinction between hardware and software. So in the digital domain, basically we have our digital computer and it implements some kind of software on top, right? We have this virtual machine, but in neuromorphic computing, the hardware is the software, like our own brains in a way. And it also assumes that computation is local in space and time, also called in-memory computing. And that's also not the case for our current digital hardware, which is one reason for why it's so energy inefficient. So then the question is, why do we want to do neuromorphic computing? So I have two quotes of Richard Feynman here. So one is, what I cannot create, I do not understand. So even from a neuroscience perspective, it might be really nice to focus on neuromorphic computing because it gains us insight into mechanisms of intelligence by just building the systems, right? Because then we really understand what's going on. And the second is an engineering argument. There's plenty of room at the bottom. So if we can push AI computing all the way down to the physics, almost to the atomic scale, then we get much more efficient systems that actually work in the physics itself. Okay, so what do we mean by a naturally intelligent system, or what do I mean by that? So it's basically a system that solves this optimal control loop in a brain-like fashion. So as an AI researcher, I always think, well, the only problem we as humans are solving, or AI should be solving, is an optimal control problem. So let's formalize that and make that the goal of our work. And there you see these equations again. So I've shown these stochastic differential equations before when I talked about modeling brains. We can also use that as the basis for building neuromorphic systems. So that's what we are really engaged in the group. So we assume that these dynamical systems are necessary and sufficient for building a new kind of AI. And I'm in good company here. So also Carver Mead, who is the founder of neuromorphic computing, which is also a big topic in Zurich at ETH and INI. Carver Mead basically stated the processes of drift and diffusion are the stuff of which all information processing devices, both neural and semiconductor, are made of. And drift and diffusion are exactly those two terms in our stochastic differential equations. So we use that as the basis. And then how do we formalize this? So what I basically say is, well, we have some kind of, so these are Mars 3 levels of analysis. So we have some computational goal. And the goal might be that I just want to compute the optimal action, A star, to optimize some kind of objective function. How long do I survive, right, in the world, for instance, or how many resources am I collecting in my environment? And then I need to implement that at the algorithmic level. And basically what I state here is that this algorithm is just a dynamical system. So I just want to turn on the dynamical system and it should solve this optimal control problem for me. And the nice thing is that if we formalize it as a dynamical system, these can be cast as equations of motion of a real physical system. So we can also start to implement it in physical hardware. Okay. Then the core question we are interested in is, well, how can those systems learn? So learning is really an essential capacity for any intelligent agent. And if we look at AI, learning is often accomplished, or actually always accomplished, in the neural network setting using the backpropagation algorithm. So this is also the machinery behind why ChatGPT works, for instance. And backpropagation is heavily successful because it led to all of these AI developments, but it's also a terrible algorithm in a way. So on the one hand, it's very inefficient. And on the other hand, from a neuroscience perspective, it's very implausible or biologically implausible. So for instance, it relies on exact gradient information, so partial derivatives. Well, does our brain compute exact partial derivatives? That's the question. It also interleaves forward and backward passes, where the forward pass is inference and the backward pass is learning. Well, it's not the case that we just infer and learn, infer and learn. These are two processes that kind of take place in parallel in a forward manner. And it also relies on non-local information. So backpropagation uses global information, and our own brains should only work based on what information is present at the level of individual synapses. Otherwise, we cannot make it work. So truly plausible and efficient algorithms should perform credit assignments. So which neuron is responsible for how well am I doing in a task, using mechanisms that are local in space and time. Okay, so the question becomes, how do we set up the equations of motion of such a system so we can have adaptation going on in this neuromorphic agent? And what we do is we model this as a slow, fast dynamical system. So we basically say, well, learning is exactly the same as inference. It just happens at a slower time scale. So we infer information, and based on this inference, we also adapt our synaptic weights. So, well, that's kind of an unsolved problem, but we have developed this approach, which gives us a partial solution to this problem, and we call it Einstein-Uhlenbeck adaptation. So the Einstein-Uhlenbeck process is a process developed in physics, but also Einstein was actually born in Nijmegen, which is where my institute is. So I had to call it, give it this name, basically. And what this process assumes is that noise in the system can actually be used as a mechanism for learning. So instead of seeing noise in our brain as a nuisance, we see it as a feature. And we're going to use that noise for learning. And well, one motivation, very hand-wavy, is stochastic release of neurotransmitters as a biological motivation. Okay, so I'm quickly running out of time, so I'll run through these equations. But okay, to give you the gist, so what we assume is that we have this stochastic state-based model we saw before. So we have internal dynamics Z. These are just our inferences. So this is basically the reasoning of the system. We have our outputs Y. So these are the control outputs. So how can I control the external environment? And I can set up that system in a certain way. What I then say is, well, if this system interacts with an environment, I might get a reward signal back. And based on this reward signal, I can compute a reward prediction error. Yeah, so it tells me about how well am I doing compared to my expectations. And finally, what this Einstein-Uhlenbeck adaptation process says is, well, we place an OU process on the parameters. So these are the dynamics of my synaptic weights, let's say. And basically what I say is, well, these parameters just randomly explore. It's just noise on the system, but they are always pulled back towards their mean, mu, via this mu minus theta term. And what I now say is that the mean of these parameters themselves, they become reward prediction dependent. And by doing it like that, it basically means that the synapses start to explore different values. And if a certain value gives you a reward that is actually giving a higher or a smaller reward prediction error than what you expected, it's actually pushing the synapses in that direction. So that's what's going on here. Okay, so in view of time, I should really wrap up and show you just one example. So let's look at the minimal example of what I consider to be like an organism. So in physics, you also have this notion of a spherical cow. So the idea is there that if you have like a complex organism, we can always represent it as a point mass, which is moving in space, and that's our representation of what an organism is. So here we have this particle that is stochastically kind of moving through space, but it actually wants to stay at the zero position. But it's always perturbed by these external influences. That's just it's basically a metaphor for life. So what I do is I represent the state of the system by Q and Q dot, which is the position and the velocity of the system. And this leads to a coupled differential equation with certain terms in there. And now the question is, okay, but I also want to give this particle a brain. And what I say is, well, let's represent that as a continuous time recurrent neural network. So the equation is shown over there. But this network itself, so it translates observations. So what is the position and the velocity of the particle? And it translates this into a control. So how am I going to push the particle in a certain direction to make it more well-behaved? So we assume that the reward function is given by this. So what it does is it penalizes the distance of the particle from zero, and it penalizes large control outputs. So what I now do is I place these OUA dynamics on all of the individual parameters of the system, and then I can ask, does it actually start to behave? And so can effective continual learning be achieved purely by running this dynamical system forward in time? So these are results. So what you see on the left is in orange, the rewards without learning, and in blue, the rewards with learning. So we are doing much better when we turn on this OUA process. What we see here on in the bottom middle picture is the parameter changes that are induced by this OUA process. And what you see on top in blue is basically the position of the particle that nicely remains fluctuating around 0 when learning is induced. I'll give you just one more slide to give a bit more of a visual. So left is particle dynamics without learning, and right is particle dynamics with learning. And so what you see is that with learning at some point, it really nicely starts to remain close to the 0 position. Yeah, so this is our attempt to come up with a new learning algorithm that is closer to how natural systems might actually change their own behavior in an adaptive way. Okay, I think I have a few more slides, but a few more. I think I have many more slides even about evolution, but I'll skip that for now. And I'll just end up with the conclusions. So both natural and artificial agents are ideally modeled as a system of coupled stochastic differential equations. That's what we claim. So on the neuroscience side, it provides a physics-inspired scientific machine learning approach to neuroscience, which leads to state-of-the-art results in system identification, but could also form the basis of model-based control for neurotech. And on the AI side, we claim that learning, inference, and control in neuromorphic systems can arise exclusively through equations of motion in the presence of stochastic perturbations, which could form a new approach to AI. So I'll leave it at this. So thanks to all the people in the artificial cognitive systems group, and thanks to the funding bodies, and thanks to you for your attention.